for Calgary-Egmont. In question period from time to time, some issues are raised which deal with matters that are before the courts. Those questions ought to be very carefully crafted, and they must be very carefully answered. And according to the standing orders of our legislature, as well as the standing orders of the House of Commons, an issue that is clearly before the courts ought not to be raised in the House. This sub judice convention is very difficult to implement, but it is a rule of the House which has been agreed to by all parties to protect the various parties involved in various legal incidents. After question period today, on Private Members' Day, the motion is sponsored by the member for Red Deer South. Will deal with the matter of the federal parole system.
Let us pray. We give thanks to God for the rich heritage of this province as found in our people. We pray that native-born Albertans and those who have come from other places may continue to work together to preserve and enlarge the precious heritage called Alberta. Amen.
Introduction of visitors.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and to members of the House a distinguished visitor in your gallery and a good friend of the province of Alberta, the Commissioner of the Yukon Territories, Mr. John McKinnon. I'd like to ask Commissioner McKinnon to rise and receive the welcome of the House. Mr. McKinnon.
Petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motion.
Member for Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give oral notice of my intention to move, following the completion of routine orders and before the calling of orders of the day, and pursuant to Standing Order Number 40, the following motion. Be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly recognize the week of June the 5th to the 11th as Senior Citizens Week in Alberta and express to all senior citizens in our province the gratitude and appreciation of all citizens of Alberta for their contributions, past and present, that they have made our province strong, viable, and the sparkling jewel that it is in the necklace of Confederation. Mr. Speaker, I have copies for all members.
Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table today a document entitled Environmental Handbook for Pipeline Construction.
Minister Advanced Education, followed by Public Works Supply and Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table two reports today required by statute, the annual report of the Student Finance Board and the annual report of the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology.
Mr. Speaker, I'm filing today the annual report for 1987 of the Alberta Association of Architects.
Introduction of special guests.
With great respect, Mr. Speaker, I introduce to you and to members of the Assembly representatives of the Northern Alberta chapter of the Society for Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, a disease sometimes referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease, a disease which attacks the motor neurons which carry signals to the muscles of the body. Mr. Speaker, some of us are familiar with that disease because that is the one of the Honourable Member for Edmonton Park Allen, Neil Crawford, a colleague of ours. Mr. Speaker, all of the volunteers with us today have been directly affected, personally or through a spouse, by this disease. And to promote National Cornflower Week, which is week of June 1 to 7, and to create awareness and promote research, we have with us today President Barbara Gabory-Bustillo, who started the Northern Alberta chapter, Secretary Agnes Primrose, editor of the newsletter, Public Relations Chairman Bernadette Cooney, Mr. Stu Bertels, who was diagnosed with the disease in March of 1984, and his wife Pat. I would ask that they rise and receive the warm and cordial welcome of the members of the Assembly.
Minister of Transportation and Utilities.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege and honor today to introduce to you a group of 35 students, teachers, and parents from the Manning Elementary School, the grade 6 class. The students are accompanied by teachers Mrs. Leslie Snyder, Charles Knopf, parents Erica Willens, Marlene Finnebrotten, Marilyn Campbell, and Reverend George Belcher. I would ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome of this Assembly.
Rocky Mountain House, followed by Red Deer South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you and through to the rest of the Assembly 42 grade 6 students from the Caroline School. They are accompanied by Mr. Apple, Mrs. Bentz, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. McFarland, Mrs. Oderkirk, Mrs. Winter, Mrs. Haney, Mr. McNutt, and Mr. Levitt, and Mrs. Luchka. I'd like to add that Mrs. Luchka is retiring this year after many years in the teaching profession. I'd like at this time to have them rise. They're seated in the members' gallery and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Red Deer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you and through you to the members of the Legislative Assembly 39 bright, enthusiastic, and model grade 6 students from the St. Thomas Aquinas School located in the constituency of Red Deer South. They are accompanied, Mr. Speaker, by their teacher, Jeanette Thompson, and by parents Mrs. Pugh, Mrs. King, Mrs. Harvey, Mrs. Laverick, Mrs. Foss, and Mrs. Peters, and their bus driver, Mr. Lloyd Bowie, and his wife, Evelyn. I would ask them to rise from the public members' gallery and receive the warm reception of this Assembly.
Minister of Energy, followed by Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly the gentleman in the public gallery who was coordinator of the Olympic projects from the University of Calgary and did a magnificent job, Mr. John Tunian. I would ask John to rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and to the other members of the Assembly this afternoon Mr. Rolando Gutierrez, who is the Canadian representative for the Farabundu Marti Front for National Liberation and the Democratic Revolutionary Front in El Salvador. He's currently on a Western Canadian tour visiting with various Albertans and other people to discuss the current situation in El Salvador. He's accompanied with today by Mr. Leonel Vizcarra of the FMLN support group of Edmonton, and I'd ask the two of them to stand and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the minister responsible for women's issues announced a $70,000 study titled Alberta Dialogue and Economic Equity for Women. My question is to the Minister of Labor, who's responsible for the Human Rights Commission, which I point out almost a year ago announced that they endorsed the concept of pay equity and announced its willingness at that time to go ahead with the study. My question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, In view of the announcement yesterday, and hope springs eternal that maybe there's a shift in government philosophy, Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister of Labor will clarify whether the government now endorses the concept of pay equity legislation.
Mr. Speaker, there has not been a change in the philosophy of this government since its inception in 1971. It has had a great interest in the equal treatment of all groups of Alberta society. That basic precept was entrenched in the first piece of legislation that was passed by Premier Lougheed's government. Those precepts continue to be those of this government and will continue to be so.
That's a little discouraging, Mr. Speaker, in view of the announcement yesterday. But my question, Mr. Speaker, the Human Rights Commission has obviously been brought on board by the government because the Premier's office is today distributing the Council's news releases applauding the government's action. I'm not so easily impressed, Mr. Speaker, because there is a concern. The concern is this, that the fact that the Human Rights Council is an advocate of pay equity while the minister responsible for women's issues is not. And my question is a simple one to the minister. Will he explain to the Assembly why the government refused to allow the Human Rights Commission to do the study and instead decided to do it in-house through the Women's Secretariat?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party is at odds with the facts. The Human Rights Commission is not an advocate for pay equity as the Honourable Member is describing it. They did make a request to look at pay equity as part of the wage gap. The decision of the government, as exemplified by the announcement yesterday by the Minister responsible for women's issues, is that rather than look at one small potential aspect of the wage gap, that we are going to address the total wage gap and also the totality of the interest of women in the workforce as well as in the home.
Mr. Speaker, the minister is just wrong because back in August the 25th, the Alberta Human Rights Commission today announced that they were for pay equity. They were for pay equity, Mr. Speaker. They also asked for the study. My question, though, to the minister, clearly they are for pay equity, and I want to know to this minister, why is it then that the minister responsible for women's issues who has come out against pay equity is the one sponsoring this study rather than the Human Rights Commission, which has announced that they're for it?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know whether it's by intent or not, but unfortunately the leader is giving a very wrong impression to Albertans of the position of the Alberta Human Rights Commission.
Mr. Speaker, read your own press releases that come out of it then, Mr. Speaker. But my question then, by this minister's answers, I have to take it that pay equity for women, I say this from this end, is one of the main ways to achieve fairness and economic equality for women. And we don't need a 70,000 study to find that out. And I'm asking the minister this. Isn't it the fact then that this study is just a stalling device and that this government has no intention in the near future of bringing in pay equity by this minister's answer?
Mr. Speaker, it would appear that the Honourable Leader is judging others by his own standards. The situation is that this government is very serious in this study. We have persistently, over the last 17 years, had a great interest in the equality of all groups within Alberta society, including women as opposed to men. The gender wage gap does exist. There are probably a multitude of reasons for it. If there is a factor which could be regarded as discriminatory, which could be corrected by the so-called concept of pay equity, then we would be interested in finding that out. But rather than just address that potential, we are also addressing the others that are included in the press release by the Minister responsible for women's issues.
Okay. Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, pay equity has been studied to death. Would the Minister show some leadership, and sponsor and get behind the Liberal Party and support Bill number 254 on the border paper that calls for pay equity in the public sector? Just get your little toe wet. It's not that far. It's not going that far.
Mr. Speaker, within the public sector of Alberta, we have already introduced a considerable number of programs specifically aimed at enhancing the possibility of women joining the public sector, being promoted within the public sector, and getting additional training within the public sector. Those programs are well established. They have resulted in a tripling of the number of women in the senior management roles, and there is currently in the province of Alberta as much as 45% of women in the positions which lead to future management roles. That has already been done. The honourable member is addressing an issue which in the public sector is not required. We are already doing what we can, and the women in the public sector know that. It is unfortunately true that it takes time for people to be promoted through the public sector, but that is happening and the statistics prove it.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question to the member from Edmonton-Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In spite of the Premier's protests that Highway 40 will not see winter openings, the Minister of Transportation has met with the BC lobby group which proposes a new highway from Elkford, BC to the Highwood Junction on Highway 40. This proposal is based on the assumption that Highway 40 would be open during the winter and would also deflect 1,000 cars per day in summer from the already depressed Pincher Creek-Crow's Nest corridor. And as a courtesy, I sent a copy of the proposal to the ministers I plan to ask questions of. In view of the potential for damage to tourism in the Pincher Creek-Crow's Nest Pass area and at Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump built with taxpayers' dollars, will the Minister of Economic Development and Trade guarantee that a thorough economic study will be done on this proposal, or better yet, will he reject it here in the House today?
Mr. Speaker, matters related to road building and transportation are the responsibility of the Minister of Transportation and Utilities, and I'm sure he'd be able to respond.
Go ahead. Sure, go ahead.
You've got one coming. I thought the economic damage to the Pincher Creek-Crow's Nest area would be the responsibility of the minister that I asked the question of. To the Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife, is the minister aware of the fact that the narrow pass through which this highway will go is a major migration route for the Highwood elk herd and other wildlife from BC to the winter range that we now protect in the Highwood area? And a highway in this pass would disrupt that migration and endanger the viability of an already drastically reduced herd.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've received no information whatsoever with respect to that highway, and if there's some suggestion made, my department, of course, as always, will do an intense overview to make sure that everything is done that can be done to protect wildlife.
Well, to the Minister of Transportation, who should have been telling you about the proposal sometime past, is the Minister giving any consideration to this proposed Highway 43, which would be environmentally ill-advised and economically damaging for the Pincher Creek-Crow's Nest area?
Mr. Speaker, I've been waiting, as you may have noticed, for a moment or two to get up on my feet to correct some of the misimpressions that the honourable member from Glengarry has left with this. I would suggest that about a year and a half to a year and 3/4 ago, I met with a group from British Columbia, the District of Elkford and the Elkford community and a number of other chambers of commerce to discuss at that time the possibility of joining up through Kananaskis country and Peter Lougheed Provincial Park, the trail that was used by the utility companies, is used by the utility companies. And at that particular point in time, Mr. Speaker, we indicated we would not, NOT underlined, entertain anything that would see that expanded to a road surface. However, almost 2 years ago, yes, and I'll re-emphasize that, at that particular time, one of the suggestions that they made to us, that they would go back and consider what other alternatives may be available to them, looking at a joining up of some route along Highway 40 with the BC Highway 40, which is what this document is. It's from the good people of British Columbia, to see whether there was a possibility of joining up somewhere along Highway 40 through a pass at that time not yet identified, and yet there was an identification that there was a possible pass through and near a fording pass, I think they called it, or fording had a plant in there. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that I indicate, too, that at no time were there any discussions predicated on Highway 40 as it is known in Kananaskis country being open all year long. And I'd like to correct that impression left by the honourable member, because he's mistaken.
Well, in talking to the group on the phone, they said their presumption is that Highway 40 would be open because they want quick access to Mount Allen. And that they said they thought they were following the best advice of the minister. In view of the Premier's statements on May 5th, that there is no plan to open Highway 40 in the future, and again, there is no intent of opening it on another winter occasion, and assuming that his statements still stand, will the Premier confirm that his commitment means that such a proposal as this would be...
Honourable member, please, we're getting into paragraphs on this final supplementary. The question, please. Oh, boy.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's typical, isn't it, of socialist thinking, where they believe, Mr. Speaker, in state control and big government, that they would want immediately to step on the individual and people who have an opinion to express and would shoot them down without even listening. That is typical of socialist thinking.
Minister of Transportation and Utilities.
It's a lot of gas. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I should also correct another comment made by the honourable member from Glengarry, and that is the fact that Highway 40 is presently open from Grand Prairie to the boundary of Kananaskis Park and from the Highwood south to the Pincher Creek area. And so the portion that we're talking about being closed is that portion within Kananaskis country south of Peter Lougheed Provincial Park, not the entire highway from one end of the province to the other. The fording pass proposal, as on this particular document is outlined, would come in south of that junction, which is already open and has been open for longer than I'm years of age.
Westlock Sturgeon on Calgary, Buffalo on supplementary.
Wondering to the Minister of Transportation if he could tell us what arguments he sees and hears in favor of changing the long-standing policy of closing Highway 40 and which would militate in favor of opening it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on that particular point, now we're talking about the closure of Highway 40, and the opening of Highway 40 was because of the 15th Winter Olympics, a very successful event held in the city of Calgary. That's right. Well, Calgary has won something. They won the world over in the Olympics. They may have lost the Stanley Cup. But back to Highway 40, the main premise of Highway 40 and the position of the government has been that that section of highway has remained closed up until the time we allowed it to be opened for the Olympics. And I think it's fair to say that we're prepared to look at any proposal that may see either a tightening up of those particular times. In other words, from December 1 to June 1, it may be that it could be December 15 to May 21, just ahead of the long weekend. And if that's of some advantage to my colleague, the Minister of Tourism, to assist in bringing tourists into the area, we would certainly consider that. I don't think at any time we have ever said anywhere that we would have that highway open on an ongoing basis forever and ever. We're very conscious of the sensitivity of the area.
Thank you. Pincher Creek, Crow's Nest.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Transportation. Would the Minister give a commitment to see that Highway 22 south from Longview to Lumbrook is paved first, and then Highway 40 from the Highwood Junction to the Crow's Nest Pass is paved prior to giving any consideration to a further east-west access route through the Rocky Mountains?
Well, if I was going to give a commitment, I would have to give it to the entire length of Highway 40 that is not presently paved, as well as 22 that's being worked on. And I'm not prepared to do that right at the moment, Mr. Speaker, in light of the dollars that we have within the budget of the Department of Transportation and Utilities. I think, however, that I should point out that in our discussions with the group from British Columbia, who were attempting to see whether there was some way or some means or some avenue or some route to connect with that area for their side, and that's for the Elk Ford area north, that we were prepared to sit down and listen to their presentations and judge them on the basis of what they may present to us. I have had nothing since the meeting that I had with them about a year and a half ago.
Westlock Sturgeon, main question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My main question today is to the Premier and concerns a great deal of our province, Mr. Speaker, is drying out and burning out while our federal and provincial Tory politicians just talk. Now, since cattle are our immediate problem, because the crops, although dried out, the need for aid doesn't come up till closer to fall, has the government prepared, now these are straight yes, no, has the government finally prepared, because I've been asked earlier, a list of community pastures, grazing leases, and crown lands in the Peace River country and the Rockies where we still have grass to be able to send cattle to if the cattlemen can arrange it?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows, the government has a committee of cabinet and caucus who are involved in water supply and contingency plans for assisting our farmers and ranchers. The Minister of Agriculture would be dealing in the area the Leader of the Liberal Party has just raised, and I'd ask him to respond.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we do have, and I just reviewed that this morning. If the honourable member would like it, we're more than happy to forward it to him. Our Assistant Deputy Minister, Mr. Bill Dent, has that information tabulated in the event that he wishes it.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I would love to see it. I was talking to the Premier, though, as Chairman of the Agricultural Committee. Now that we've located the grass, after 2 weeks, we finally got the Premier knowing where the grass is, or the Minister, maybe he was looking for the wrong kind, I don't know. But now that we found it, is there going to be any form of a transportation grant? Any form of a transportation grant in order to facilitate cattlemen moving their brood cows to where the grass is?
Mr. Speaker, obviously one of the concerns would be to make sure that it's needed. And then I would only point out to the honourable member that in every case that there's ever been a problem with forage for basic herds and for our farmers and ranchers, the government has moved to help them.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier again, I want to get specific again. As you know, we have many grazing leases the provincial government charges the ranchers for, but there's very little grass on it. Will we go this far? Will the government go this far? Cancel the grazing lease fees charged this year to those cattlemen south of the Peace River District?
Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the items that seems so interesting these days is that the people in rural Alberta, the farmers and ranchers, are not quite caught up with the kind of panicky comments coming out from politicians. And in fact, my discussions with farmers and ranchers as late as Sunday of this last week, was that things are actually being handled very well. They're pleased with the initiatives. The one farmer said to me that, you know, unless you turn on the radio or pick up the paper, you don't realize how bad off you are, even though things are going very well.
Mr. Speaker, he must be talking to a Tory in the middle of an irrigation district. I mean, there's all kinds of people without water, without the cattle. The cattle are not getting any grass. Would he go this far, Mr. Speaker? The very simple solution. Put a $100 grant now for each brood cow, to each cattleman, to use as they see fit to either transport the cattle to where the hay is, bring in hay, or put in some water. A $100 grant per cow.
My only response to the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, is he's raised one potential form of assistance. As I said earlier, the government has helped probably in a way much more effective than that in the past. We'd consider his representation. I appreciate the honourable member who has a great deal of experience in this area raising it with me, and I'll have the committee who's working on contingency plans give full assessment to his proposal. I only come back to the list of commitments that the government has made to farmers and ranchers in the past. And that is, every time that they have needed help by natural or other disasters or problems that face them, this government has been there and helped.
Minister?
To supplement the answer of the Premier in saying that typically our government is ahead of the Liberal Party again, in that one of the areas of discussion that we look at is where the grass is and how we can move cattle. One of the areas that's raised by the honourable member is that what would we do about grazing rates? It's too early to make that judgment yet. I expect June could be a wet month. That could change the picture significantly, but if the carrying capacity and when we assess it in July is different, Mr. Speaker, we always are prepared to work on that.
The member for Vegreville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier might be satisfied with the federal government's response to the drought situation, but I'll remind him that that same bunch of Tories gave $5 million to the Gramesians to build a water park in West Edmonton Mall. And I'd like to ask the Premier why he isn't instructing his Minister of Agriculture to reinstate the feed freight assistance program that helps with the costs incurred in transporting hay from one part of the province to another part of the province. We've been making the suggestion for months.
Mr. Speaker, actually, I already answered the question today. The honourable member may not be listening. If he had been listening, he would have known that, first of all, I did not make any comment about the federal government's program at all. He may want to get his comments in about the West Edmonton Mall, but I haven't referred to the federal government's program at all today. The second thing, Mr. Speaker, I've said, and it's been a fact in this province for many years, that when assistance is needed, it's provided by this government. Has been in every case. It has been in cases that there have been payments on a per-head basis. There's been assistance with grazing reserves, and there's been the help with moving the forage to the cattle. Those are all things that may well need to be done. And if they need to be done, they will be done if they need to be done. Again, the same as I responded to the leader of the Liberal Party. The honourable member makes a representation. Obviously, it's the kind of thing that would be considered in a total assessment of options. But come back to the fact that when it's necessary to help our farmers and ranchers, this government will do it.
Okay. Member for Little Bow, followed by Old Stoodsbury, Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Agriculture, and the drought situation that has faced us as farmers has brought on some unique and unusual circumstances to be faced by the crop insurance program and as well the hail insurance policy. For example, I had a farmer call me last night where his land is sandy and too dry to seed. And the question you raised with me, and I raised this with the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is that would the government be prepared to adjust the crop insurance program so that if he does not seed that land and that he practices good soil conservation, would the crop insurance program provide benefits to him as a person that has been a long-time subscriber of the crop insurance benefits?
Mr. Speaker, may I indicate my appreciation to the honourable member for Little Bow for his concern as it relates to the dry conditions we are going through. As the honourable member, I'm sure, is aware, the Premier and the Associate Minister announced yesterday some substantial changes to offset concerns as it related to fall seeded crops. The specific suggestion the honourable member has given to us today by way of representation is going to be reviewed by our ongoing committee on Monday, June the 6th in Regina, when they are getting together to examine further ways that we can offset some of the difficulty of the drought conditions.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, would the Monday's meeting as well review the extension of the deadline for seeding in terms of an adjustment due to the drought?
I will bring that to the attention of our officials who are meeting. I should have explained to the honourable member that the officials that are meeting are a federal provincial team that are doing an overall assessment. They've been very involved with the proposals that we have announced to date as it relates to the crop insurance, and we will also raise them with the chairman of our hail and crop insurance within the province.
Mr. Speaker, final supplementary to the Minister. The newly introduced Soil Conservation Act states that it is the duty of every landholder to take appropriate measures to prevent soil loss and deterioration. To the Minister, will the regulations of the Alberta crop insurance program be reviewed and adjusted to enhance new conservation initiatives in the province?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and this was highlighted in the statement that the Premier, in conjunction with the Associate Minister, released yesterday when we did announce our changes to hail and crop, whereby proper soil husbandry was going to be a key criteria of any changes that we did make, recognizing that our soil is one of our most, if not the most, precious resource that we do have.
Final Little Bow. Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, to the minister, and he may remember if he's looked at pictures, there was a type of equipment to windrow or make large grooves in the soil, drifting soil that was prevalent and supplied by the government in the 1930s and 40s, soil drifting. Has he made any assessment to see whether any of that kind of equipment is available to lone farmers in order to stop soil drifting?
Mr. Speaker, it could be that our department has. I haven't, but I will follow it through for the honourable member.
Athabasca Lancadish.
Yes, read the water assistance program. Why is the minister persisting in asking farmers to put a $150 deposit to rent the pump from his department to pump dugout? I've had a number of calls complaining about that.
Mr. Speaker, it's a normal practice in recognition of the severe dry conditions we are facing. We reduced by 50% the charges that do apply to our pumping and piping equipment. I'm happy to report to the House that we've had some 540 applications to date to make use of that. We've serviced close to 400 of those already. The majority of the farmers are very happy with the reduction that they are presently paying, Mr. Speaker, and it is serving a very worthwhile need.
Olds Didsbury, followed by Edmonton Millwoods, Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to address my remarks to the Premier. For many years, this province has supported the need for payment of the Western Grain Transportation Subsidy, or what is more commonly known as a crow rate subsidy, directly to the producer rather than the railway. I was very pleased, therefore, when I saw that the communique from the Western Premier's Conference refers to an agreement on this method of payment. Would the Premier please advise members of the nature of this agreement that was reached at this conference?
Mr. Speaker, it is true that the matter of agriculture was the #1 item discussed by the premiers, and I should just draw to the attention of the honourable member and all members that agriculture as a national priority was endorsed as part of our agreement. Then the drought situation, deficiency payments for 1988, soil conservation methods. But then, Mr. Speaker, a breakthrough that we were able to make for the first time, that all premiers of Western Canada, endorsed the request by the province of Alberta and the province of British Columbia that individual provinces should have the ability to determine the method of paying the crow rate in their province. In this way, Mr. Speaker, we would have in Alberta and in British Columbia an opportunity to conduct a pilot project where we would have the payment go directly to our individual ranchers and farmers so that they can make the decisions rather than to the railroads. And we're quite confident that a pilot project, if you follow up the Western Premier's recommendation, a pilot project will provide an opportunity to have the crow benefit go to the farmers and ranchers and prove the position of the Albertan and the Alberta government, the British Columbia government, and the people of Alberta, the farmers and ranchers who are out there doing the work and know that the best way is to have those funds flow to them, not to the railroads.
My supplementary question then is to the Minister of Economic Development and Trade. Could the Minister indicate what steps the government is taking towards achieving a Pay the Producer pilot project?
Mr. Speaker, the steps have been carefully worked out, and Mr. Speaker, in 1981, the Progressive Conservative Party held a province-wide meeting in Red Deer with farm representatives from across the province, a 2-day intensive meeting where we discussed agricultural issues. The key issue we discussed was the Western Grain Transportation System and changes that were needed. Conclusion was reached that the crow payment needed to be changed. We pursued that decision aggressively, and the most recent has been a caucus committee chaired by the chairman of our agricultural caucus, the member for Tabor-Warner, who's conducted meetings throughout the province to assess the views of Alberta farmers on this important issue. The conclusion has been that Alberta farmers, by about 70%, favor a change of method of payment. And this is in order to improve the efficiency of Alberta agriculture, in order to allow more value adding in Alberta and not distort agriculture. And therefore we are working with the federal government, British Columbia, and the Alberta Wheat Pool to design the mechanism by which those changes might be implemented.
To the Minister of Agriculture then, with a change in the method of payment, would it still be necessary for this province to continue the crow offset program?
Mr. Speaker, it would be our plan as we progressed into a method of payment that went directly to the farmers to withdraw our crow offset, because it is an offset to what we consider a very discriminatory practice on the part of the federal government, whereby the payment does go to the railways. We see this as a very big step forward, and the Minister of Economic Development has outlined the success that we've met with to date, and we're delighted with that success, acknowledging that it's not going quite as fast as what we would have liked.
Supplementary, Old Stidsbury.
My final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, is back to the Minister of Economic Development and Trade. With regards to this initiative, what representations have been made to the federal government?
Mr. Speaker, there have been extensive representation and discussions with the federal government. Most recently, when the Honourable Mr. Bouchard, the new Federal Minister of Transportation, was in our province, I raised the issue, and we had an opportunity to discuss it and agreed that we would meet again on a more formal basis to pursue those discussions.
Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Vegreville.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just wondering whether this has been thought through. The free trade agreement quite clearly says, Mr. Speaker, that the crow rate subsidy cannot be used to put any agricultural products into the U.S. just for export. So how in the dickens are you going to get away with paying the crow rate subsidy direct to the farmers without infringing on your Free Trade Act, your pet act?
Mr. Speaker, it's obvious the member for Westlock Sturgeon has partially looked at the issue, but as we've explained on a number of occasions, that another reason for changing the method of payment is that by only applying the crow benefit to export grain that would attract the potential of countervail from the United States or from other countries. The advantage of paying the producer is that you remove that threat.
Beckerville.
Mr. Speaker, it's nice to have the opportunity to address at some length in question period a matter of federal jurisdiction that impacts on the province of Alberta, but I'd like to ask the Premier if he's aware that changing the method of payment to the so-called pay the producer method will have the immediate and direct impact of transferring the burden of the $21 a ton payment to the the farmer who delivers grain to the elevator at the time of sale.
Mr. Speaker, actually that would not be the case. In fact, Mr. Speaker, by paying it to the farmer or rancher, you would have, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity for individual Albertans to make their own choices. Mr. Speaker, one of the concerns I know of the socialist government is they don't like individual choices or individuals to make those decisions. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, that the...
Fine, Honourable Premier. Fine. If I don't want to hear the answer, we'll go on to the next question, which is Edmonton Mill Woods, followed by Calgary Buffalo, followed by Calgary Fish Creek.
Speaker,
that's fine. That's fine, folks. I got lots to do this afternoon, too. The chair had indeed recognized Edmonton Mill Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions today are to the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care. Now, while urban Albertans are generally well served by medical practitioners, northern communities in this province, in particular Native communities, have often had difficulty attracting and keeping doctors and other healthcare professionals. However, there are many foreign medical graduates who have passed the Medical Council of Canada's evaluating examination and are willing to serve in smaller rural communities, but are being blocked because they can't get access to internships from getting licensed and serving those communities. So I'd like to ask the Minister this question. Since he's been aware of this problem for almost 2 years, what discussions has he had with the College of Physicians and Surgeons, his federal counterpart, and within his department to try to remove these roadblocks so that qualified physicians can serve the healthcare needs of northern Albertans?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the honourable member is not correct in his assumption that the problems exist only in northern Alberta. The facts of the matter are that there has been for many years difficulty in attracting physicians to small communities and particularly one physician practices. We have an equally difficult problem in south central Alberta and other parts of the province as we do in northern Alberta. But leaving that aside, the question of whether or not I should intervene to urge the College of Physicians and Surgeons to qualify doctors to practice in this province from other parts of the world that have not been able to meet the standards laid down by the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Alberta is something I simply would not do. I believe very strongly that our citizens are entitled to the very best medical care, and that includes the qualifications of medical doctors. And members know full well that there are many countries in this world whose educational requirements are far below those that exist in Canada and Alberta. On the other hand, I have encouraged the college very much to try to push Canadian and Alberta graduates of medical schools out into our rural community, and have discussed at length with the Alberta Medical Association the problem of doctors congregating in Edmonton and Calgary, and even suggested on several occasions that we might have some allocation of billing numbers to force doctors into smaller rural communities. That was set aside over the course of...
Thank you, Honourable Minister. With great concern about the time, the question period. Edmonton Millwoods.
Supplementary to the Minister, he knows that internships cost money, and that's really one of the things that has to be addressed. But the question I want to ask him is simply this. Given that this problem affects so many doctors and physicians and other healthcare professionals from a variety of ethnocultural backgrounds, can he advise us what initiatives he's going to take to ensure that this government's stated commitment to multiculturalism is going to have some impact in the healthcare field and is not just tokenism?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member needs to know that this government isn't going to put in place some system of qualifying doctors for residency or for practice that mitigates against people who were born and raised in this country, and to have some kind of a program that will allow immigrant doctors to practice and get privileges ahead of people who went to our own medical schools is not something I'm interested in doing. That's a typical NDP possibility, but it's certainly not one that we would entertain.
I guess he doesn't care about the rural needs of people in northern Alberta, but let me ask him this. Would he investigate the case of Dr. Mustafa Abdullah, who's an Egyptian doctor who lives in Fort Vermilion, who has the support of the Tall Cree Indian Band, the school division, and several other people there? He wants to practice, he wants to serve, he's passed the Medical Council's evaluating examination, but he can't get an internship.
Mr. Honourable Member, the order, the question has been asked without going through all the qualifications of a particular individual.
Mr. Speaker, I'm well aware of that particular case and several others, and the matter is entirely one for the College of Physicians and Surgeons, who has the full responsibility for licensing doctors to practice in Alberta.
Final supplementary to the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Premier has spoken frequently about the value of multiculturalism and how the greatest asset of our province is our people, will he make a commitment, will he direct his Commission on Future Health Care or his Multicultural Commission, or both perhaps, to address this issue so we can put an end to this gross waste of qualified medical expertise in this province?
Obviously, Mr. Speaker, when you have commissions to handle things and you get the people, highly respected members of our public, to hold hearings and then to make recommendations, you hardly direct them then what to do.
Calgary Buffalo, followed by Calgary Glenmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's really not an issue of discriminating against Canadians. Can the Minister tell this House why we keep bringing in doctors from South Africa, England, and elsewhere every year to serve rural areas when we have a base of immigrant doctors who have passed their exams but just can't get the qualification through the absence of internships. It's the system.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member needs to recognize the difference between a doctor who is able to come into our country or our province and fully qualify him or herself through the College of Physicians and Surgeons to practice medicine and then go into some rural community, as opposed to an immigrant doctor or a refugee doctor who still has to take out residency and qualify in some other ways. We like to encourage Alberta and Canadian graduates to move into smaller communities, but when that doesn't occur and a rural community is able to contact a doctor from some other country who can be qualified quickly or is fully qualified to practice medicine here, then that occurs. It would be wrong to simply say, no, they cannot come in to service that community, because we hope that somewhere down the road a refugee doctor or some other immigrant doctor may be able to qualify. I add once again, Mr. Speaker, we are in no way discriminating against newcomers to this province in terms of their ability to practice medicine. But there is a set of standards, and those standards simply must be met. Anything less would be a disservice to the people of Alberta.
Agreed. Calgary Glenmore.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Advanced Education, can the Minister tell the House how many graduates from the School of Medicine we have in Alberta that are qualified to take these jobs in rural Alberta or anywhere in Alberta?
I'm not sure whether the honourable member is asking for the specific numbers or what percentage of each class is qualified.
Ready. Main question, Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. This is to the Premier, Mr. Speaker. The federal government has just passed two pieces of progressive legislation with respect to smoking, which is in contrast to the provincial government, which allows almost unrestricted smoking in many government buildings, including this legislature and this chamber, which is the most public room in the province. However, I do understand that you can't smoke in vaults in this building, which means that you can hold a smoke-free meeting in a vault. Now, I'm wondering whether the Premier can tell us why his government does not have in place a comprehensive policy which provides for the right to breathe clean air by those working in and doing business in government buildings. Why is it left to each department?
Mr. Speaker, having suffered all these years with smokers around me, I take the honourable member's representation. But I would point out to him, Mr. Speaker, this is the legislature. This is where laws are enacted. The honourable member has the same right as anyone else to introduce legislation. Introduce it and convince the House.
Well, we will, but I'm wondering, will the government, will he commit his government then to supporting legislation similar to the new House of Commons Bill 204, which provides that every employer under federal jurisdiction, including the government, shall provide a smoke-free environment for employees, subject, of course, to the right to provide designated smoking rooms for use by smokers. Will he support that type of legislation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, no one would be more offended more quickly than the honourable member for Calgary-Buffalo if we somehow dictated the way MLAs would think and vote on legislation.
That sounds very wimpish. I'm wondering whether the government then would simply agree to have the matter looked into and to set up an all-party committee of the legislature without delay in order to bring forward proposals for comprehensive government policies to the fall sitting of this legislature.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member, as I said earlier, can move a motion, a resolution, if he likes, or move legislation. And there's no magic about the fall session. This may be the fall session of the legislature.
Well, that is a red herring. Well, I have in fact raised this matter with the government House leader to no avail, and I'm wondering whether in the meantime, as a matter of leadership, whether the government would support an initiative if I introduced it to this House to prohibit smoking in this legislature and in this chamber.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in a way, it's the question he asked in his second supplementary, and I'll give him the same answer. If the honourable member wants to move a resolution or present legislation, nobody would be more reasonable about it than I would, since I have never smoked all my life, and therefore I would ask him and see whether his arguments are good enough to carry the legislature. That's the system working.
Time for question period has expired. May we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Additional supplementaries? Member for Stettler, followed by Edmonton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct a supplementary to the Honourable Solicitor General in that any action taken legislatively with regard to smoking in the legislature will adequately protect the civil liberties of all the citizens of Alberta.
Edmonton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, since smoking is the #1 cause of premature death due to heart disease, what actions similar to the federal House is the Minister of Community and Occupational Health taking to remove smoking in public places through government or elsewhere? What initiatives is he taking that are as bold here in Alberta?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to introduce in the Assembly some 27 young Albertans last month who participated in a contest, province-wide contest, that promoted a smoke-free lifestyle. It was a very successful campaign, and that's where we're starting our efforts, Mr. Speaker, in the schools with students in this province, so that they learn about healthy lifestyles.
Time for question period has expired. We have a request under Standing Order 40. Member for Highwood speaking to urgency.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request unanimous consent under Standing Order 40 to move the following motion. Be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly recognize the week of June the 5th through the 11th as Senior Citizens Week in Alberta, and express to all senior citizens in our province the gratitude and appreciation of all citizens of Alberta for their contributions, past and present, that have made our province strong, viable, and the sparkling jewel in the necklace of Confederation. Mr. Speaker, the reason I ask for the unanimous consent of the Assembly at this time is to make the citizens of Alberta, both rural and urban, aware of the upcoming week and urge them to also recognize our senior citizens during this special week.
Is there unanimous consent to urgency? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Urgency. Speaking briefly to the motion.
Mr. Speaker, as chairman of the Senior Citizens Secretariat Advisory Council, and it gives me great pleasure to proudly announce that the week of June the 5th to the 11th has been declared as Senior Citizens Week in Alberta. This is the third year in which we have set aside a special week to honor the older citizens of our province. Spearheaded by the Provincial Senior Citizens Advisory Council in conjunction with the Senior Citizens Secretariat, this week provides us all with the opportunity to express our special appreciation to our older fellow citizens for the contributions which they have made, are now making, and will continue to make to the life of our communities. The legacy of their vision, their tenacity, and hard work has meant an enviable lifestyle for those of us who benefit by being Alberta residents today. The theme for the week will be Seniors, Active in the Community. And there are three objectives which I hope that all of you will keep in mind as we celebrate this week. They are to recognize and honor senior citizens in Alberta, to highlight the positive contributions which seniors are making in their communities, and to promote understanding and encourage positive attitudes towards seniors. The last objective, I believe, is most important. It is time that we realize that the growing numbers of older persons in our province are not a problem, but rather represent a rich resource of talent and strength and a triumph for our society. May I take this opportunity to thank the Minister of Social Services, Connie Osterman, for all her assistance through the past year in this particularly pleasant portion in that particular part of the structure of her portfolio. I urge you all to do your utmost to ensure that Senior Citizens Week is a success in our province, and in keeping with that urgency, I further urge all members to support this motion.
Question? Call for the question. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries unanimously. Orders of the day.